Okay, cool. So now we kind of get onto the part where we start to try to, I guess, understand Genesis and also understand I guess, the opposing arguments too. And you've kind of talked about the fact that as someone who lives in the 21st century, we have to be careful how we interpret such an ancient text. So again, these dot points might fall victim to that issue that you brought up. However, I do want to go through these sort of things because let's say I've been fortunate to live with a few atheist housemates, and let's just say they love challenging me about my faith, and they love to bring up things like Big Bang, dinosaurs, do we come from apes? Was it 7 days or 1 million years? I mean, we've kind of already gone over that. But the last point was kind of interesting. They love to ask me, did God allow incest within early human beings? So if you could just, yeah, again, I'm going to give you the ground. If you could just go through those little dot points, how you would, yeah, picture yourself in my shoes, and then atheists grilling you with these sort of questions.
Yeah, well, in every man's terms, Big Bang Theory was actually, you know, theorized by a Christian in the sense of a Catholic, right? So a Jesuit astronomer, Lemaitre, came up with the idea of the Big Bang, but he didn't call it that. It was actually called that as a criticism by a more skeptical scientist called Fred Hoyle, a British scientist. And that was Fred Hoyle's off-the-cuff kind of characterization of this new theory. And Fred Hoyle didn't like it because it was too like biblical creation for him. This idea of essentially the cosmos coming out of nothing very suddenly, he was like, that's way too close to creation of the Bible, and he couldn't stomach it. It was too biblical for him, right? So it's interesting just looking back into the early history of that a little bit, and I don't know a great deal more than that really, but a lot about the Big Bang looks like things coming into being quite dramatically and quite quickly from a nothingness at the start. It's pretty compatible in certain senses with early Genesis, down to light coming out of darkness. There's this completely dark phase, and then the very possibility of light becomes possible on a Big Bang model. But I mean, I hold that lightly, and I don't really care if the explanatory model changes down along the way. But as far as the time involved, I'm not so troubled about that, because I don't think the Genesis one is describing the actual time elapsed as God created, right? So there's a handy saying that I like to keep in mind, that described is not explained, right? We sometimes get the idea into our heads, and sometimes skeptical opponents of Christians get the idea into their heads. Oh, if I can describe the process, then it's natural, whatever that means, and God had nothing to do with it. All right, sometimes we fall into the same either-or thinking ourselves. But describing something is not the same thing as explaining it. And the fact that we can describe the gestation of a human being in the womb, and how their cells divide, and how you end up with bone cells and heart cells and muscle cells and all of that kind of thing, the Bible, in places like Job 10 or Job 31, happily describes human beings as created by God, and a couple of places in the Bible refer to he who formed the eye and he who formed the ear, right? So each human being, the affirmation is clearly there in the Bible that we were created. But we can describe the process of growth and development of the human being. So are we going to say, as soon as I can describe the formation of a thing, God didn't do it? That would be clearly unbiblical thinking. And am I going to say that everything God does is done instantaneously, and anything that takes any time is not created by God? Well, I have to throw out a bunch of creation texts, like where it says that God created Israel, where it says God creates historical events, along with where it says that God creates individuals, right? So clearly things that take time and build up from simple to complex can still be the handiwork of God. In fact, everything is that's not a human artifact, according to the Old Testament. Regarding dinosaurs, I mean, this might not be satisfactory to some people, but I don't think the writer could describe dinosaurs because they didn't know about them. And so they could talk about grand sea creatures like they do in day 5 of creation. That they'd come across some really, really big ones, or they knew people who they'd heard of them. But they couldn't describe dinosaurs because that was out of their sphere of knowledge. It's clear all the way through Genesis 1 to 11, as we talk about the origins of things, that things are described in terms of what an Israelite commentator could know, right? So in Genesis 10, where it describes, here's the nations of the world and how they're all related, it describes them out for a couple of 100 Ks in each direction, right? Maybe 500 or 1,000 Ks in each direction. On a world map, it looks like a little circle around the Middle East. Right?
Yeah, true.
Doesn't describe where we get Chinese people or Eskimos or Norwegians or, South American Aztecs or Central American Aztecs. He can't describe those. He doesn't know them. He describes the known world and maps out that part of the cosmos. In that case, it's the human cosmos, right? So the same thing applies to living creatures. Can't describe dinosaurs, doesn't know about them. But the broad categories of Genesis 1 are big enough to hold dinosaurs. There are land ones. There are, I think they have a different name. I think it's pterosaurs when it's flying, dinosaur-like.
Correct. Yeah.
But basically, those three life zones, there's the ocean, there's the land, there's the sky, right? Whatever dinosaur you can dig up, it lived in one of those three zones. So essentially it's got its day of creation already there. It's got its category, right? But the writer wasn't talking about it because he had no idea they ever existed.
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting that you can't actually find the word dinosaur in the Bible. I think it does mention beasts. It does mention, if I'm not wrong, there are a few versions that have the word dragon. So do you think that could allude to big animals, reptilian animals like dinosaurs? Or again, am I reading too much into it?
Well, it would be difficult for any writers to talk about them when they'd never encountered them, right? As far as we know. Like geologically, they can't show any place where dinosaurs and humans coexist, right? So I'm pretty sure as we get to know biology, we just have to face one of the simple facts is that there are extinct ecologies prior to our own, right? And so the biblical writer can't talk about those. He never saw them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that kind of makes sense because especially with the way you view the quote unquote days, right? Because if you were someone that viewed 7 days as literal 24-hour days times 7, which would be 168 hours, people would immediately point the finger and be like, oh, but dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. But I guess when you have the view of time the way you and I do, I guess it doesn't pose as big of an issue having that point of view.
It's a bit like finding a new. It's like finding a new species in an ocean trench, right? It doesn't create this crisis for your faith because you go, well, day 5 describes sea creatures. It doesn't really matter that I didn't know about them all. Yeah.
No, that's a good point. Like it never said in Genesis 3 that the only land animals created were the ones we see in zoos today. So it could include things that are extinct. So no, that is a good point.
We've been given the boxes there, in those days. We're given boxes, and we'll know if something belongs in the each of those boxes. Yeah.
In regards to, again, this is a pretty uncomfortable topic, but I think it does need to be explored. I get the hardest question I've had to try to answer from my atheist friends is the question of incest within early humans. So yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, there's an illustration. I'm still thinking about whether to use it. This is the classic old question. It's centuries old. Where did Cain get his wife? And then you can ask, where his immediate descendants got their wives. And
for those who don't know, Cain. For those who don't know, Cain is the son of Adam and Eve. So
in Genesis 4. And a similar question is, who's he scared of? Like the mark of Cain for his protection. he's afraid that because he's a murderer now, whoever finds him will kill him. Well, we haven't been told about any other people, so who's he afraid of? And when he goes off and builds a city, according to the story, who's it for? Right? So essentially this story in Genesis 4 and earlier and later, it doesn't really deal with whether there are other people on the planet or not, right? So I think of all of these first 11 chapters, maybe chapter 1 is so global it doesn't really apply to chapter 1, but subsequent chapters when you've got these human actors at play, I think of it like the TARDIS out of Doctor Who, right? When you go inside the TARDIS, it's really big, right? There's a world within a world there inside the TARDIS. But from the outside, you can tell it has limitations and there's more to be described that falls outside the TARDIS. So Genesis 1 to 11 or Genesis 2 to 11 is a bit like the TARDIS. Inside, it's kind of massive. And it describes the tribes and nations of Genesis 10 as if there are no other tribes and nations. It describes the flood through the middle chapters as if there's no land not touched by the flood. It describes the family that descends from this first couple as if there are no other people. But when you exit the door of the biblical story, you go, oh, I now understand that I'm going to have to look further for other sources of information if I'm going to fully understand who all the nations of the world are and how we got people in South America and my paleoanthropology. And there's more to learn about the origin of languages than 9 verses in Genesis 11 alone can tell me. We start to realize there is a world outside the TARDIS that is going to take more description than 11 short chapters of the Bible can do, including about the origins of things. However, there's a reason why those chapters have that TARDIS-like quality, and that is because they're going to frame out the whole of creation for us in lots of ways, right? They're going to give us concepts that will cover global things, that they're global concepts. They're going to cover the origins of things, but they're not going to be exhaustive factually. They can't be, It's not Encyclopedia Britannica. It's 11 chapters of the Bible. It's a few pages in our Bibles. So it's going to frame out reality. It's not going to describe all of reality and its origin.
So could it be that the Garden of Eden was just like a little microcosm that we were fixated on when reading Genesis, and there could have already been something else out there that we were not, I guess, privy of when we read those chapters?
Yeah, this thinking kind of led to a whole thing over the last about 400 years called the pre-Adamite hypothesis. And in fact, maybe this is the origin of like Israel's ancestors, but there were other people and that kind of thing, right? I actually think there's no point having that conversation because the TARDIS-like quality of those early chapters, they're not covering all possible realities, but they're not covering them either. Now, I know it's going to be a struggle for people to make sense of what I'm saying. The point of kind of hinting that, Cain's got to get married to someone and he's afraid of some other people are going to kill him. All right, I'm going to describe who all those other people were at the same time. It's not the point of the story to even suggest them. It just doesn't cover everything there is to say. So there's actually no point trying to integrate the story of Cain and, his murder of Abel and all that kind of thing. There's no point trying to integrate that into what I know about the out of Africa theory because they're whole different ways of looking at things. But the story of Cain, for instance, starts to deal with this propensity we have for violence and what do we do with it? And it all kind of barrels downhill in the story until there's no solution but the flood, right? And the basic problem is God wanted to create life, right? We talked about life in chapter 1, but the living creatures he created are busy trying to create death. They are the ones destroying creation even as God tries to make it. And it becomes a contest. There are more babies being born, there are more people being murdered. What's going to win, life or death? That's what that part of the story seems to be about.
And I guess the last point there, in regards to are our ancestors apes? Do you have a similar approach? Like, that's not something you choose to think about, or?
Mm. Yeah, this is interesting, right? This is really the pointy end of the evolution question for Christians,
Yeah,
because it all feels most painful when we're talking about ourselves, and the image of God feels most threatened. So a couple of things I want to
yeah.
say about this.
Mm-hmm.
My first thing would be that I'm no expert about the science, so it
Mm-hmm.
needs to be kept in mind. I'm not a scientist. I'm sort of a Bible reader by practice. The second thing would be
Mm-hmm.
genetics seems to have changed the whole game here, really, in
Mm-hmm.
that you can DNA sequence human beings of every stripe, and you can DNA sequence, um, you know, the nearest things to humans on the postulated evolutionary tree, and you can find matching gene sequences. And you can actually find, I understand, if I've got this right, so there's the caveat, if I've got this right, you can find, gene sequences that seem to be broken or damaged as it regards their original function. And I think with human beings and a couple of nearby species, the ability to synthesize vitamin C within our own bodies is one of those damaged genes. And so it's damaged for us. So we have to consume vitamin C or we get scurvy eventually, right? We can't make our own. But
Mm-hmm.
most other mammals, I understand, can manufacture their own vitamin C. So it's just
Mm-hmm.
us and a few other ape-related species that can't do that,
Mm-hmm.
So pending that that's right, and some people might go, well, I know something about the science he doesn't know. Okay, fair enough. But that's what I've heard Christian biologists say. And
Mm-hmm.
it seems to be a bit of a clincher for the fact that there are these family traits that go beyond humans into nearby species. Now,
Mm-hmm.
one thing that Christian philosophers sometimes raise, and this has been raised in a book and I think conversation with a guy I've met recently who's a really good Christian thinker, and that is we have a problem with the standard understanding of evolutionary theory where and this is what young earth, strict creationists will object to, is that it seems to mean that all of the death and all of the savagery and the one species killing another, nature red in tooth and claw, was Tennyson's phrase. All of that becomes inherent to creation and no longer an intrusion, like it's a necessary evil now. But thinkers like this, one thinker like this is Terence Fretheim, an Old Testament commentator, who says we've got to be careful about reading the early chapters of Genesis as if evil was necessary. It didn't poke its head in from the side. It was all a part of creation. Once you've got, it involves defining what evil is, but once evil is part of creation, then it's only one more step to essentially say it's part of God's nature, or it was authored by God. So that's kind of an unsolved problem for me. I feel like the scientific evidence for evolution is hard to simply bypass or ignore, but the philosophical problem or theological problem remains of saying a big part of the biblical claim is that the corrupt and the morally wrong and the evil and the violent, those things weren't part of God's original creation intention. His purpose for creation. So that seems really important to hold as well. So you could say there's a bit of a surviving tension there for me that sort of remains unsolved. But the Fretheim himself, who emphasizes how important that is, says, look, I think as Christians we're forced to admit some form of evolution, that we're not going to be able to dodge that forever. So that's probably near to what I'm thinking at the moment.